The mayor asked to see the warrant. The captain didn't answer him. He looked instead at the 10 armed men standing at his back, rifles up, boots planted, waiting on his word. That was the warrant. Within the hour, the entire town treasury was gone. Signed for, receipted. Walked out the front door by a homeless shoemaker, wearing a coat he'd assembled piece by piece from junk dealers and pawn shops. His name was Friedrich Wilhelm Voigt. The trick he used, the uniform, the tone, the badge, nobody dares question twice, is still being used on people today. The ledger on this one opens with almost nothing. A 57-year-old man, 20 marks of second-hand military costume. No home, no papers, no legal right to even be in the city he was standing in. By nightfall, that ledger would carry a mayor's arrest, a police shutdown of an entire town's phone lines, and 3,557 marks and 45 pfennigs in stolen cash. Real money, enough to run a working-class household in Berlin for close to 2 years. Voigt had already spent close to 30 of his 57 years behind bars, more than half his adult life. This was supposed to be the year he went straight. Here's why that still matters. Every fraud that works today, the fake police caller, the fake bank investigator, the man in a high-vis vest who walks past your building's front desk without a single question, runs on the same operating system Voigt discovered in 1906. A uniform gets treated as proof. Nobody checks the paperwork when the costume is convincing enough. Voigt didn't hack a system. He simply put on the one thing nobody in Prussia was allowed to question. To understand how far that got him, you have to understand what a Prussian captain's uniform actually meant that year. It wasn't a costume. It was the visible body of the Kaiser's own authority, stitched onto cloth. German military culture even had a word for the obedience that uniform commanded. Kadavergehorsam. Corpse obedience. Absolute, unthinking, immediate. Questioning an officer's order wasn't rude, it was a court-martial offense. Voigt had spent decades inside that system, watching guards, watching officers, watching exactly how command posture worked from the wrong side of a cell door. He knew what a captain sounded like long before he owned a captain's coat. So he built one, not from a tailor. He had no money for a tailor, but from flea markets and second-hand dealers scattered across Berlin and Potsdam, buying the coat here, the boots there, a rapier with a star badge somewhere else, for a total of roughly 20 to 30 marks. Piece by piece, nobody sells a police uniform whole, but somebody always sells the parts. On the morning of October 16, 1906, he collected the finished uniform from a train station locker, dressed, and walked toward the military district of Tegel. Not the barracks themselves, where an officer on duty might recognize a stranger, but the road outside them, where tired soldiers walked home in 2s and 3s with nobody watching too closely. He stopped 4 grenadiers and their sergeant. He told them he was acting, in his own words, on the highest cabinet orders from the Kaiser himself. Nobody asked for paperwork. You don't ask a captain for paperwork. Then he made his one genuinely clever move. He sent the sergeant, the only man experienced enough to notice something wrong with a second-hand coat, back to barracks with a message. The 4 young conscripts left behind had never once been trained to doubt anyone above them. That still wasn't enough men to take a town hall. So Voigt walked to a nearby rifle range and requisitioned 6 more soldiers from a completely different regiment. 10 men now, from 2 separate units, neither one aware the other's captain didn't exist. He paid their train fare out of his own pocket. He bought them beer at a station layover and handed each man a spare coin for lunch. A small, generous, entirely unnecessary kindness from someone who owned almost nothing, designed for exactly one purpose. Comfortable men don't ask questions. By 3:30 that afternoon, the squad reached Kopenick, a small town outside Berlin, and marched straight to the Rathaus, a red brick town hall with a clock tower nobody there would ever look at the same way again. 4 soldiers took the main doors, let officials in, let nobody out. 2 more sealed the ground floor. Voigt went upstairs alone. He found Chief Secretary Max Rosenkratz first and arrested him in the Kaiser's name. Then he walked into the office of Mayor Georg Langerhans, a trained lawyer, a man who had spent his career reading exactly this kind of authority for a living. Langerhans asked to see the warrant. Voigt didn't have one, and he didn't need one. He gestured at the armed men in the doorway and said, "These are my authority." The mayor, a lawyer whose entire profession rested on due process, surrendered without another word. Downstairs, Treasurer von Wiltberg was ordered to open the safe for a full audit. Voigt counted every mark himself. The total came to 3,557 marks and 45 pfennigs, a sum that, adjusted for what it could actually buy, comes out to somewhere between 26 and 27,000 euros today, enough to cover a working family's rent, food, and heat for years. Von Wiltberg, still playing by the rules of a robbery that technically wasn't a robbery, asked for a receipt. Voigt gave him one. He signed it, Captain von Malzahn, the real surname of the prison warden who had supervised him for 15 years. A joke only Voigt understood, filed permanently into the town's official records. He wasn't finished. He hired 2 horse-drawn carriages and sent the mayor and treasurer off under armed guard to military headquarters in central Berlin, out of the building and out of his way. Then he walked to the post office and shut down the telegraph line to Berlin for a full hour. No calls out, no warning ahead of him. By 5 o'clock, he'd told the remaining soldiers to hold their positions a little longer, walked to the train station alone, bought a plain civilian suit, changed in the lavatory, and boarded a regular passenger train back into the city. With the money. At 6:30, the carriages reached the guardhouse in Berlin. The mayor of an entire town, in full formal dress, stood in a military entrance hall, claiming he'd been arrested by his own government. General Kuno von Moltke, commandant of Berlin, checked the receipt, then checked the name. There was no Captain von Malzahn. There was no operation. None of it had ever existed. What almost nobody remembers is that the true story of how Voigt got caught didn't start with the army at all. It started years earlier, in a shared prison cell, with a conversation he never should have had. 10 days passed. The story ran in every newspaper in Germany, and half of Europe was laughing at Berlin. One reader wasn't laughing. Paul Kallenberg, a former cellmate of Voigt's, remembered a plan Voigt had once described out loud, robbing a town treasury disguised as an officer, and recognized every detail in the coverage. He gave police the address for a 3,000 mark reward. On October 26th, detectives found Voigt at breakfast in his lodgings. The evidence hadn't gone anywhere. Uniform pieces, stolen cash, all of it still sitting in the room. His trial opened on December 1st, 1906. Prosecutors wanted him treated as a direct assault on state authority. His defense argued something colder, and in its way more damning. Police supervision laws had made it functionally impossible for any released convict to find legal housing or work, that the state itself had built the trap Voigt eventually walked into. The court didn't buy it. Voigt was convicted of forgery, impersonating an officer, false imprisonment, and unlawfully exercising public office. 4 years. The public sided with him anyway. Newspapers ran fundraising drives for a man who had just robbed a town hall at gunpoint. Even the Kaiser found it funny. Reading the police report, Wilhelm II reportedly called him an amiable scoundrel, and took the whole affair as proof that no army on earth could match the discipline his own troops had just shown a stranger in a rented coat. 20 months into a 4-year sentence, on August 16, 1908, the emperor signed an absolute pardon. Voigt walked out of Table Prison a free man, and for the first time in his life, a famous one. He'd published a memoir the following year. It became an international bestseller. He toured variety halls across Europe and the United States in a replica of the same uniform, signing postcards for people who once would have crossed the street from a man like him. Denied permanent residence in Germany, he settled in Luxembourg, went back to cobbling quietly, and bought one of the country's first private automobiles on his royalties. He died of flu complications on January 3rd, 1922, at 72. At his funeral procession, a passing detachment of French soldiers asked who was being buried, told it was the Captain of Köpenick. They raised their rifles and gave him a full military salute, an honor guard in the end, for a man who had never worn a real uniform in his life. In the end, the ledger was simple. Friedrich Wilhelm Voigt gained 20 months of freedom, traded for lifelong fame, and a word, Kopenick, that entered the German language to describe exactly this kind of audacious fraud. Kopenick lost 3,557 marks and 45 pfennigs, its mayor's dignity, and an hour of silence on its telephone lines. And the uniform that made all of it possible? Never issued by anyone. It came from a junk dealer's table, and it cost less than the beer he bought the soldiers who wore it into history. So, did the uniform make the man? Or did it just prove how little anyone was checking in the first place? Tell me what you think in the comments. If you want more cases like this one, subscribe. The Ledger runs a new one every week. Next time, the Ledger opens a case from 1925. A man who sold the Eiffel Tower to a scrap metal dealer, took a signed check for it, and then sold it again to someone else the very same week. That one's coming.